The explosion ripped through the east wall. The unfortunates standing closest were caught in an avalanche of debris as the blast tore Site-19 open. Huge clouds of dust were kicked up, smothering the personnel inside. Some of them raced frantically towards panic rooms. Others struggled back up with their ears ringing from the blast, or tried in vain to help their fallen colleagues out from under the rubble. The ones that were still alive, at least. Locke cursed under his breath. They were early. It had taken him months to infiltrate his way into the ranks of the SCP Foundation under an assumed identity, not to mention the years' worth of psychic training he'd had to undertake in preparation for today. And just moments after Locke had sent out a coded signal, giving his comrades the go order for the mission, they were already messing up the finely tuned schedule. Typical of the grunts, he thought. Taking advantage of the confusion as the attack team steamed into the facility through the new entrance, Dr. Locke shoulder-barged his way past researchers still in a blind panic. The sounds of gunfire erupted in the corridors as the duplicitous doctor made his way down the route he'd memorized months ago. While security teams were being shot down by the invading operatives, Locke sent his plan into motion. After all, the all-out attack on Site-19 was just a distraction, covering for what he was really up to. Reaching the containment cell, he swiped his card, the 3 hefty locks keeping the door sealed unbolting in rapid succession. There were normally 2 guards posted here, but just as planned, they'd been called in to aid the rest of the site's security against the oncoming attackers. Opening up the chamber, Locke saw his first objective, sitting behind the glass of its hermetically sealed case. The second his foot crossed the threshold into the room, Locke could feel the faint murmurings of the mask on the edge of his cortex. He'd been trained for this, he reminded himself, pushing its whispers back using his practice techniques. For now, his psychic fortitude would hold, but he knew he had to be quick. The airtight glass case containing the anomalous object had been constructed using SCP-048, an exotic metal alloy capable of eroding one's mental faculties. It kept the psychic compulsion of the mask suppressed, but the longer he was near it, the more Locke's own cognitive barriers would begin to degrade. Fishing specialized protective gloves and a cutting tool he developed out of his lab coat pocket, Locke got to work, slicing a circular hole in the surface of the glass. A near-perfect glass disc came loose, creating a gap big enough for Locke to retrieve the mask. Instantly, he felt a sting behind his eyes, his temples throbbing as the anomalous object tried to get inside his head. Locke grunted, resisting the influence, locking eyes with the mask, staring into its empty sockets as it frowned discontentedly with its exaggerated theatrical expression. At the point Locke felt like he was about to burst a blood vessel in his eye, he felt the presence in his mind recede. It was like an intense pressure being lifted off his brain. He thought that he'd managed to withstand the telepathic pull of the mask, resisting the urge to wear it. What he didn't realize was that he'd been looking into his thoughts. It saw what the deceptive doctor was planning, and approved. With his gloves protecting his hands from the corrosive black liquid that would soon start secreting from the porcelain mask, Locke lifted SCP-035 out of its cell and rushed back out into the hallway to find it a host. When the explosion had rocked Site-19 and emergency alarms had started blaring, the structural damage done to the facility hadn't been random. The strike had been localized to Research Sector 2 of Site-19, timed to occur when SCP-049 was in transit out of its containment cell. The Plague Doctor had to be secured to a Class 3 humanoid restriction harness during transportation, which included a locking collar and extension restraints. Given that it was delivered a fresh animal corpse to study every 2 weeks, the Plague Doctor had to be moved out of its cell to clear up the remains of this fortnight's carcass. While it was secured, 2 armed Foundation security guards were monitoring it. However, when they'd heard encroaching gunfire, the pair of them had rushed to assist the security forces attempting to repel the incoming attack. Both were killed in the fighting, and the attackers were able to proceed mobilizing through the corridors towards their target, the still restrained Plague Doctor. With SCP-049 unguarded, they were able to secure it with ease just as Dr. Locke appeared, with the Possessive Mask following him, attached to the face of the latest unfortunate Foundation researcher Locke had found to use as a temporary host for the anomalous mask. As the host expired, corroded by the black substance leaking out of SCP-035, Dr. Lock pulled the mask from their melted face, approaching SCP-049 while the operatives kept him covered. The Plague Doctor protested, remaining ever polite and asking that Lock stay away, only for everything to go dark as the possessive mask was slipped over SCP-049's face. The mask seemed to instinctively reshape itself to accommodate the beak of the Plague Doctor's skull. The last thing SCP-049 heard was the sound of backup rushing into Site-19. Reinforcements from a mobile task force come to help quell the attack. But in the ensuing cacophony of gunfire, sounds and even sights faded away to the Plague Doctor, leaving him in what looked like a windowless space, void of any light at all, a place he had been before. On the outside, SCP-049's accelerated healing factor immediately kicked in when the corrosive substance from SCP-035 began oozing from the porcelain. It melted into the cartilage and bone of the Plague Doctor's beaked face like acid, but he seemed to be able to heal from the damage as quickly as it occurred, allowing the possessive mask to use him as a stable host seemingly in perpetuity. Inside, though, things were far less stable. The presence of the mask was familiar, like standing in the comforting aura of a close friend. It had been a while since the pair of them had talked, lifetimes even. The last time was almost lost to history. The Foundation had scrubbed all mention of it when they revised SCP-049's file. A while ago, the Plague Doctor had managed to breach containment, only for around 5 minutes, but he'd spent that brief period of time visiting SCP-035, taking advantage of the lack of supervision to go and converse with the mask. When the Foundation caught him, he'd come quietly, and afterwards was noted as being much more talkative. It had seemed to the Doctor observing him that this conversation with the possessive mask had lifted the Plague Doctor out of a slump. Instead of moping around his cell afterwards, SCP-049 was humming old church hymns to himself, even comforting his patients before he performed surgery on them. Now the mask was closer than ever, slipped over SCP-049's face. In his mind, he could almost see it, the tragedy porcelain frown appearing to speak with him. And so the anomalies talked. The Plague Doctor greeted the possessive mask, apologized for having been absent for so long. The mask didn't seem to take it well. Its dark influence was all around SCP-049, threatening to overwhelm his body. Naturally, he pushed back, repentantly explaining that he couldn't allow SCP-035 to use him as a host. It would impede the Plague Doctor's work. He still had so much to do, so many patients to cure of the pestilence. The cure. He was the cure, and now the mask was part of him. Its voice was eerily calm, conveying something rare from SCP-035, care. Normally, the mask was raging, violent, and psychopathic, a manipulator with little regard for the lives of its hosts. In contrast, it considered the Plague Doctor to be a close friend, though one it could just as easily use as a means to its own nefarious ends. It began to convince SCP-049 that the Foundation had prevented him from achieving his purpose. He could heal the world, rid everyone of the pestilence, if only they weren't so determined to keep him behind bars. The Plague Doctor knew all too well that the Foundation didn't understand his goals, and certainly didn't approve of his methods. The mask continued its coercive whisperings. Perhaps the good doctor had forgotten what he was really trying to cure, after being cooped away for so long. Maybe that's why the Foundation kept him locked up, not just to stop him, but to make him gradually lose sight of his medical mission. What if they weren't just unaware of the pestilence, but also a symptom of it, the disease? They were the disease, and now the mask explained it. Humans, their current state was so far from what they had once been back when SCP-049 had first found them. They'd been that way for such a long time. The pestilence had taken root in them so far back that now it was accepted as normal. They'd become used to it, living with the symptoms, afflicted but oblivious. The Plague Doctor remembered, compelled by SCP-035, that his many creations were a restoration of humanity's true selves. He had been helping them, curing them, and the Foundation had vilified him for it. But now, together with his old friend, he could continue his work. Dr. Kane Pathos Crow and Agent Jade watched the monitors intently as security personnel interrogated the man who infiltrated the Foundation. There was still no word from recovery teams about the situation. 2 dangerous anomalies had been freed from containment and were now on the loose. Yet with a global network of agents, satellites watching the Earth non-stop, and access to every surveillance device on the planet, the Foundation still couldn't track down SCP-035 and SCP-049. The security footage from during the attack earlier that day confirmed their worst suspicions, though. It seemed the Possessive Mask was now being worn by the Plague Doctor, using him as its host. All thanks to the man on the monitors. Dr. Locke, as he'd gone by, spat blood on the floor after another strike from the security officer. Through each punch, each deafening shout demanding him to talk, he'd kept quiet, silently counting the passing minutes in his head until he was certain enough time had passed. Things were sure to be in motion now, Locke thought, so much so that the Foundation couldn't stop what was coming. No sense in stalling any longer. Now it was time to rub their noses in it. He explained the whole plan, how he'd been recruited into the Chaos Insurgency, and developed a strategy to not only get back at the SCP Foundation, but to wipe the entire world clean, ready for a fresh start. A clean slate, a cured world. It was only moments after witnessing Locke's confession that Dr. Crow and Agent Jade were called urgently to the Site-19 Command Center. Each of them had been assigned to the anomalies that were now loose, and the first reports had just come in of where to find them, only it looked to already be too late. Satellite feeds over a city in the Midwestern United States had tracked a massive amount of movement, what looked like a veritable tidal wave of people staggering through the streets, attacking and accosting any civilian in their path. Zooming in revealed the mob wasn't human anymore. Instances of SCP-049-2 were everywhere, the horde of pestilence-cured zombies overrunning the area, with a cloaked figure marching ahead of them, leading the charge. People caught by the horde were dragged kicking and screaming in terror as the zombies brought them before what looked to be their leader. The cloaked figure reached out a hand to each person presented to him, his touch killing them instantly. The few who managed to free themselves and try to fight the figure would find themselves screaming in agony as their hands made contact with his robes made of a corrosive black fluid. The Foundation looked on in horror as within minutes, the Plague Doctor's horrific work claimed an entire city. Projections and estimates started pouring in from analysts that at its current rate, the spread of SCP-049-2 instances could have become worldwide in as few as 28 days. The satellites honed in on the figure leading the horde from one city to the next at alarming speed. Its shadowy hood moved like liquid, partially concealing a beaked face with the eyes and mouth of a familiar mask, and it was smiling. Now check out What If SCP-035 Fought the Mask, and SCP-049 What Actually Is the Pestilence, the Plague Doctor's Questions and Theories for more.